definitely the sort of seat of thanks, and so I want to echo some of the thank yous that were made earlier to the Lewis Walpole Library for being utterly formative in my second book, and it's a kind of ongoing relationship for which I'm very grateful. I especially want to thank Cindy for asking me to direct The Mysterious Mother. While I have a few 18th century restoration comedies under my belt, I had never tried my hand at tragedy, and she both trusted me with it and kind of talked me into it, and I'm so glad you did. I also want to do one other thank you for someone who has been, for me in this project, behind the scenes and a huge help, and that's Joe Roach. Joe challenged me about 7 years ago to do the Scholarship of Performance, and it was one of those suggestions that was utterly transformative for my professional life and my intellectual life and my students' lives. So I just want to thank you for that, Joe. It's definitely enhanced my ongoing love affair with the 18th century. All right, well, when we started rehearsals for The Mysterious Mother, these many 3 days ago, the first thing I said to the cast is the only way out of this play is over the top. We were faced with a less than 48-hour start to finish process, and a play that is genuinely interesting. And so that over-the-topness played itself out in a few different ways. For those of you who weren't in on the secret, the two evil priests were played by an actual priest and a Catholic theologian. We also went to some pains, mostly Cindy's pains, to try to reproduce the Beauclerk illustrations in our lavish costuming, which included a little gift from the universe. When we got Florian's costume back, that beautiful purple costume, we were told it was insured for extra, and it's a very beautiful costume, because it was worn by a famous person. When he took it off the rack and looked in the tag, it said Mr. Lane. It was worn by Nathan Lane sometime in the 70s. So everything here is over the top, even the Nathan Lane connection. And finally, it felt over the top or puckish or downright heretical to be projecting images of this Gothic castle on Louis Kahn's clean, modernist wall and see it work so well. So the cast has already been working on the musical. We rehearsed Mamma Mia last night after the show, and we have a social media campaign. It's #Who'sYourDaddy. So this panel is about staging The Mysterious Mother. And in the process that we just went through, I think we experienced some of the negotiations that earlier panelists have already talked about. Our first negotiation was sort of with the seen and the unseen in this play. And that's reflected in the way we were negotiating David's brilliant cut back with the original text and the things that we could not play, but tried to show you or let you hear. We also were, I think, always negotiating that line between camp and tragedy, which turns out to be a really productive space, and we found things that we didn't expect to find. So we hope that inquiry will continue with these papers. So first, we will hear from Marcie Frank. Marcie is a professor of English at Concordia in Montreal, and she teaches mainly 18th century literature. She's finishing a book, The Novel Stage, From Comedy of Manners to Melodrama, which is about the ways that theatrical conventions shaped the novel between the Restoration and Jane Austen. Her most recent essay on contemporary American queer writer Dennis Cooper, Cooper's Queer Objects, now I have to go read this now, can be read in the current issue of Angelicae. All right, that's my bid. And the title of her talk today is Wilful Walpole, Performing Publication in The Mysterious Mother.
Hi, and thanks for coming, and thanks for having me, to Jonathan Kramnik and Jill Campbell, and I'm delighted to be here to share my work with you, and I really enjoyed the staging, and we'll see what you think about this. The mystery of the Countess of Narbonne, the mysterious mother for whom Horace Walpole's Gothic tragedy is named, is established at the outset of the play by elaborate, varied, and even contradictory discussion of her motivations before she appears. The porter describes her virtuous piety, and the priests Martin and Benedict discuss her proud secrecy. If her self-reliant despair gives her some dignity when she first comes on stage at the end of Act 1, Florian's reflections on her treatment of her son Edmund at the beginning of Act 2 complicate without rendering comprehensible her character. He even depicts her mourning the death of her husband as hypocritical. Sable chambers, the winking lamp, the pomp of midnight woe, are but a specious theater on which the inconstant mind with decency forgets its inward tribute. Language that resonates with the Castle of Otranto introduces his ironic question: who can doubt the love which to a father's shade devotes the son? The answer, the mysterious mother who has banished that son and determined that he can only enjoy his inheritance from afar. Holy shades of Hamlet, Batman. For Florian, Edmund's Robin, the male line has been interrupted by the excessive performance of female grief set in a specious theater. The mystery of the mysterious mother is sustained until the play's end, when the Countess reveals to Edmund that his marriage to Adeliza is incestuous, not only because she is his sister, but also because she is his daughter, the offspring of a sexual encounter he, unbeknownst to himself, had enjoyed with his own mother, who disguised herself as his beloved Beatrice on the very night of her husband's death. The Countess then kills herself. Though she initially inspires pity, and Martin and Benedict, who scheme to acquire her property for the church, invite skeptical distrust, when her crime is revealed in, quote, a moment, as Walpole himself described it in the postscript, quote, a most odious moment of depraved imagination, end quote, the play is evacuated of any internal ground of moral judgment, for the dark reversal does not restore the respectability of the church. Walpole knew that the double incest would render the play unperformable, yet he nevertheless adapted it to the scene. He exhibited a similar ambivalence about its publication. Today, I want to suggest that the specious theater of the mysterious mother, with its ambiguous relation to performance and its strange publication history, provides us with a template for Walpole's other endeavors. Walpole recognized that the suppression of the Countess's secret was essential to the whole design of the play. As he observed in the postscript for the edition of 50 he initially printed at Strawberry Hill in 1768, in order, quote, to palliate the crime and raise the character of the criminal, the audience must be prejudiced in her favor. For this reason, he further explained, I suppressed the story till the last scene and bestowed every ornament of sense, unbigoted piety, and interesting contrition on the character that was at last to raise universal indignation. Singling out some features of the play for critical appreciation, quote, terror and pity naturally arise from the subject, the moral is just, and it conforms to the three neoclassical unities, he nevertheless distinguished his desire of striking a little out of the common road to introduce some novelty onto our stage. He risked the disgust he knew the play would provoke, and though he apologized for it, he also implied it was justified for the introduction of the new character of the mysterious mother. He echoed these thoughts in Thoughts on Tragedy, composed in 1775, but only published in the posthumous complete works of 1798. The thoughts take the form of 3 letters to Robert Jephson, whose play, The Count of Narbonne, was a successful adaptation of The Castle of Otranto that, as its title suggests, amalgamated elements of the mysterious mother. It premiered in 1781 and was performed 37 times up to 1798. Quote, if there is any merit in my play, I think it is in interrupting the spectators fathoming the whole story till the last and in making every scene tend to advance the catastrophe. Exhibiting a self-consciousness about his strengths and weaknesses as a playwright, Walpole remarked on his attraction to the topic of incest and passed on a story idea for one of his favorite subjects, Don Carlos. As Walpole explained to Jephson, quote, why I gave up this fruitful canvas was merely because the passion is incestuous, as is most unfortunately that of my mysterious mother, though at different points in time, and that of Carlos a pardonable and not disgusting one. I shall rejoice at having left it if you will adopt it. Suggesting that Jephson adopt a story less controversial than his own, Walpole here encouraged his protege by his own example. Evidently, Walpole relished his provocative effects on others. And here I'm going to recapitulate some of the publication history that we heard about from Dale this morning. In the short preface he wrote for the edition of the play he let Dodsley print in London in 1781, which he claimed to be publishing only to prevent piracy, Walpole again warded off blame with apology. Quote, "He cannot be more blamed than he blames himself for having undertaken so disagreeable a story and for hazarding the publicity by letting it go out of his hands." End quote. Peter Sabor has observed that Walpole's vexed attitude toward publication is taken to a compulsive level with The Mysterious Mother. He desired to circulate in print and to withhold himself from such circulation by means of which he could control critical response. The preface to Dodsley's edition is dated April 29, 1781. Two letters of later that year, one to Conway dated May 28th and the other to Mason dated July 3rd, indicate that though notice of publication prevented the spurious edition, it went ahead anyways. Walpole, however, retained the edition and circulated copies to friends, as he had also done with the 1768 edition printed at Strawberry Hill. Jephson's The Count of Narbonne was printed by Thomas Cadell right after its premiere with a dedication from Jephson to Walpole dated November 17, 1781. I'm here floating a speculation that even though Walpole didn't say so himself, perhaps he sought to coordinate the printing of his own tragedy with the performance of Jephson's play. He was involved with Jephson's production in other ways, including having loaned Alfonso's armor. Even though he didn't circulate the publication of the play, he may have wanted to have some printed copies available to re-stimulate interest and coordination with the production of Jephson's play. Walpole was right to be concerned about the reactions his play would produce. Frances Burney recorded her disgust upon the discovery of the Countess's secret when she participated in a closet reading of the play. She felt, quote, "a sort of indignant aversion rise fast and warm in my mind against the willful author of a story so horrible. All the entertainment and pleasure I received from Mr. Walpole seemed extinguished by his lecture." Burney's strong response, as her narrative of her reading experience shows, derives from her initial enjoyment of the play and the interest it elicited in the character of the Countess. Her indignant aversion bespeaks a betrayal of expectations which she directs against the, quote, "willful author of a story so horrible." Both Walpole's consistent reflections on the disgust the play must induce and Burney's response indicate that the play's streamlined structure was integral to its design. Its smooth acceleration made its ultimate revelation all the more offensive. Though many critics understand Walpole's native English Gothic to be opposed to a neoclassicism associated with the French, Walpole, whose Francophilia is complex but there, demonstrates a strategic neoclassicism that serves to manage innovation while maintaining audience appeal. In the postscript, he minimized his investment in critical approbation of the play for abiding by the rules, even though he himself introduced those features for praise. Quote, "If the critics be pleased with this conformity to their laws, I shall be glad to have their satisfaction, though for my own part I set little value on such merit, which was accidental and at best mechanic and of a subordinate kind and more apt to produce improbable situations than remove them." So this sort of typical double gesture that lets him praise himself and then not take it away. An ideal venue for self-expression and the manipulation of response, in many respects, The Mysterious Mother occasioned an emblematic performance of Walpole's authorship. That theater-pervaded Walpole's authorship can be seen across his writings. The Castle of Otranto entered the world as Walpole's production under Shakespeare's mantle, and Marshall Brown has described it as a formal transmutation of Restoration tragedy. Walpole's treatment of his 1773 comedy, Nature Will Prevail, mirrors that of his tragedy. He sent it to George Coleman at Covent Garden, who, quote, "pressed to have it enlarged," but then, as the short notes on the life of Horatio Walpole record, he, quote, "would not take the trouble to do so for so slight and extemporary a performance." Earlier in his career, and Dale also talked about these forays into theatrical composition. He had written The Dear Witches, a political pamphlet in dramatic form that parodies the witches scene in Macbeth. It was laid out with a list of dramatis personae, 5 scene divisions, and scene and stage directions when it was published in the Whig journal Old England. He also enjoyed his own capacity to produce disgust in Tale 4 of the Hieroglyphic Tales, for example, in which the Archbishop of Tuam drinks an aborted fetus he had mistaken for a peach in brandy. Critics have long agreed that Walpole's oeuvre exhibits a remarkable consistency across genres and media, including architecture, gardening, and collecting, which has led to psychobiographical reflections and disquisitions on taste. Recently, Sean Silver has proposed that the design of and writing about the villa at Strawberry Hill are emblematic of Walpole's understanding of history. Proposing that the villa served as a sort of enlarged Wunderkammer, Silver tunes into the experiences Walpole sought to supply his visitors, though he doesn't bring out the connections between historiography as a grand house tour and the theater. Building on Silver's account, James Lilly brilliantly grasps the effective intensities and strenuous demands of Walpole's double conception of uniquity as collectible, the singularity with no intrinsic value that is common and may even have been produced more than once, as in an old Roman shoe whose worth is independent of its former wearer, and the rare curiosity of a monstrous birth. Both operate on the margins of the market, remaining collectible only to the discerning eye. The specious theater of the mysterious mother conforms to both aspects of uniquity, depicting the suspension of the patrilineal line so that the disgusting generativity of the maternal can be revealed and then expunged. The play's subject matter is monstrous birth. Unperformable and yet intermittent circulation, the play's singularity is redoubled, guaranteed by its appearances in print. As the mysterious mother brings out more clearly than any other example, Wilful Walpole enjoyed provoking and amusing his coterie, and then sought to extend the circle to strangers, provided that they proved their eligibility for mentorship by withstanding his tests that included their capacity to enjoy disgust and to admire triviality.
Thank you so much for that paper, Marcie. Our second speaker will be Jean Marsden, who's a professor of English at the University of Connecticut. She's the author of several books, including The Reimagined Text, Shakespeare Adaptation and 18th Century Literary Theory, Fatal Desire, Women's Sexuality in the English Stage, and Theaters of Feeling, Affect and Performance on the 18th Century Stage, this last one forthcoming. Here, be notified. She is also the associate editor of the works of Anne Finch, as well as numerous articles on restoration and 18th century theater. Her title today is Family Dramas, The Mysterious Mother and the 18th Century Incest Play.
So thank you, and thank you for letting me be a part of this, even though I'm not really a Walpolean. A guilt-ravaged woman agonizes about a crime she committed 16 years ago when she took the place of a maid who had arranged a tryst with her son. As the result of this liaison, she becomes pregnant and gives birth to a daughter. Claiming that the girl is an orphan, she raises her until she, at the age of 16, when her banished son returns home, sees the beautiful girl and marries her. Consternation occurs, and the woman stabs herself in a fit of frenzy. Sound familiar? What I've just described is the plot of The Fatal Discovery, or Love in Ruins, an anonymous late 17th century tragedy. Despite these similarities, I do not mean to claim that The Fatal Discovery is the source for Walpole's play. He claims that he got the idea from a real-life event, although the advertisement for the 1791 Dublin edition does refer to this contemptible performance as a means of praising Walpole's greater delicacy in keeping his play off the public stage. Rather, my interest today lies in considering the mysterious mother in the context of 3 other plays that, like The Fatal Discovery, deal with incest as the crisis point for the tragedy. Unlike The Fatal Discovery, all 3 plays were successful in their own time and were staged well into the 18th century. The first 2 plays I want to consider focus on brother-sister incest and represent the horror it visits on the unwilling participants. The first is the most popular of all Restoration and 18th century incest plays, Thomas Otway's The Orphan, in which Polydore takes his brother's place in bed with Monimia, the titular orphan, and here we get echoes of orphaning from the paper this morning. What Polydore thought was simply an illicit assignation was actually Castalio's and Monimia's wedding night, making this bed trick an act, however unwitting, of incest, brother with sister-in-law. Once discovered, both participants recognize the act as a pollution that can never be removed. It is a horrid deed that results in the suicide of both participants as well as the sinned against Castalio. A more involved but less catastrophic example occurs in Dryden's Don Sebastian, in which the hero weds his half-sister, a relationship the two discover after the fact. In doing so, they ignore repeated warnings and admonitions from other characters as well as prophecies from the past. And in this, it's reminiscent of the greatest of all incest plays, Sophocles' Oedipus, a play that was adapted by Dryden and Lee more than a decade earlier. Sebastian and his bride, Almeria, consummate their marriage before the relationship is known, but unlike the orphan's bloody conclusion, they separate. Alminus to a distant convent and Sebastian to a desert hermitage, a fate similar to Walpole's Edward and Adeliza, Walpole's 2 innocent sinners. These plays deal with brother-sister incest, and while they are reminiscent of the Edward Adeliza storyline in The Mysterious Mother, they have little in common with the central focus of Walpole's play, the Countess and the act that torments her. Of greater interest here is Edmund Smith's Phaedra and Hippolytus, a play originally staged in 1707 with an all-star cast including Thomas Betterton, Elizabeth Barry, and Anne Oldfield. Smith's play went through multiple editions and remained in the repertoire through the end of the 18th century. Smith was a Greek scholar, and David Erskine Baker describes Phaedra and Hippolytus as a scholar's play. The play has several interesting parallels to The Mysterious Mother. The most obvious of these is the nature of the incestuous desire. Mother for son, in this case, a stepson. Although Phaedra's incestuous desires are never acted upon, the fact that she desires Hippolytus while considering him her son is made clear. She describes her feelings as a bestial passion, while stressing the exact nature of her sinful desire and exclaiming near the beginning of the play, "Oh, can you keep it from yourselves, unknow it? Or do you think I'm so gone in guilt that I can see, bear the looks, the eyes of one who knows my black detested crimes, who knows that Phaedra loves her son?" There is no secondary incest in Phaedra and Hippolytus, and we discover early in the first act the nature of Phaedra's sin. Phaedra and Hippolytus opens with Lycon, a scheming minister of state who, much like Walpole's Benedict, plots throughout to destroy the play's heroine. Smith's character, however, is more successful than Benedict in prompting his victim to confess her sin, and under the guise of wise counsel, he uses it to torment her further, urging her at one point to yield to her husband Theseus's desires, advice that she regards with horror, exclaiming, "In the father's arms, oh horrid thought, oh execrable incest, even in the father's arms embrace the son?" And this rather lurid passage was omitted from the Bell's edition in 1777. In the end, she, like the Countess, stabs herself in a fit of guilt-ridden frenzy. While Smith's play was generally praised praised by critics, some took offense with Phaedra's willingness to confess her crime in front of an audience, seeing the event of her speech as an act almost as grotesque as the incestuous desire itself. Even Dryden's Norma Hall in Aurengzebe, as Charles Gilden notes, kept, quote, her brutal passion to herself, not like the bolder Phaedra, making confidants and breathing her incestuous desires in the face of a whole court. Having incestuous desires is bad enough. Articulating these desires to others constitutes an even greater sin. Walpole himself stressed the illogic, if not the sinfulness, of having a character discuss her sin in front of an audience. Digressing from a discussion of folk revel to state, quote, with all the difference of Grecian, French, and English manners, it is impossible to conceive that Phaedra trusted her incestuous passions or Medea her murderous revenge to a whole troop of attendants. While Walpole does not comment directly on the criminality of Phaedra herself, his linking of her with the notorious villainous Medea is suggestive. As of now, I have found no definitive proof that Walpole knew Smith's play, but I feel certain that he was familiar with it. Now, I do not mean by drawing these connections to suggest that the mysterious mother is just merely a pastiche of tropes commonly found in earlier plays. Rather, examining the places where it diverges from the norms seen in other publicly staged plays illuminates the uniqueness of Walpole's tragedy. Uniqueness that I would argue would have prevented it from being stageable drama, at least in the 18th century, since we know from last night's performance that we were able to stage it in the 21st. To do so, I would like to turn back to the fatal discovery, that contemptible performance with the plot that so closely parallels that of the mysterious mother. Bad though this play may be, it nevertheless possessed qualities that allowed it to appear on the stage, something that would have been impossible for Walpole's play, no matter how carefully he worked to engage sympathy for his heroine. The most notable differences occur early on in the play. In the fatal discovery, Berengaria, the countess figure, does not knowingly sleep with her son. Rather, she thought she was arranging to sleep with her husband, who had abandoned her bed. As her confidant, Arapasia, later explains the convoluted chain of events to Berengaria's son, the night before you were sent to travel, you passed an engagement with a young and foolish maid of the house to meet that night. Your father had made another such appointment, which was by one discovered to your mother, and my unhappy lady, in her stead, resolved to meet her husband, but by accident she did mistake the room, and came to you, but in the morning, slipping from her husband, as she believed, for fear of discovery, she met my lord just come from his intrigue, and then she found too late her fatal error. Like Phaedra, Berengaria has confessed her guilt to a trusted confidant, but in her case, the confidant, taking on the role of the playwright, can remind Berengaria and the audience that her act was no more than a fatal accident, possibly even condoned by heaven. Berengaria considers the real source of her guilt to be her own wanton love for her husband. She should have considered his desires, not her own, and allowed him to continue with his adulterous behavior. Her act, while not appropriately wifely and submissive, was nothing more than an accident. Destructive, yes, but unintentional. By contrast, Walpole's heroine is not the victim of a fatal error in household geography, something that distinguishes her from her predecessor. Because of this, Walpole explains, he felt the need to palliate the crime, first by creating the figure of the evil monk, Benedict, and then by creating a situation in which the Countess was to be imagined as thrown off her guard by a combination of grief and disappointment. Her fondness for her husband was thus, in some measure, the cause of her guilt. Yet the Countess's act was deliberate, even if it was not premeditated. She explains that in the moment when she waited longingly for her husband's return, and some of these lines should be familiar from last night's performance, she saw him presented a bloody corpse before me. I raved. The storm of disappointed passions assailed my reason, fevered all my blood. And at that moment, she learns of Edmund's proposition to the maid. Thou canst not harbor a foreboding thought. More dire than I conceived, I executed. Guilt rushed into my soul. My fancy saw thee, thy father's image. Grief, disappointment, opportunity raised such a tumult in my madding blood, I took the damsel's place. This was no accident, no case of mistaken identity. While the Countess's raw grief, born out of her love for her husband, may be a mitigating factor, there is no doubt she knew what she was doing, even if she could not foresee the consequences of her crime. This deliberate behavior, this articulated fact of incestuous desire, is what I suggest would have made the mysterious mother unstageable, a fact that Walpole's friend, William Mason, as we were just discussing, implies when he suggested a very few alterations that he thought would make the play more stageable. After praising the play, he comments that there is a capital defect in the denouement, and, quote, prove the thing feasible. There is a sketch he sends of such alterations as I think necessary. His advice was to render the incestuous act an accident, the result of the Countess's supposed jealousy over her husband. In other words, to replicate the plot of The Fatal Discovery, that contrived but stage-worthy drama. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jean. We're going to have lots to talk about the stageability versus unstageability, I can see in the talkback. Next, it's my pleasure to introduce Al Coppola, who is an associate professor of English at John Jay College in the CUNY system, and he's also the past chair of the Columbia University's Seminar in 18th Century European Culture. His first book, The Theater of Experiment, Staging Natural Philosophy in 18th Century Britain, is a critical study of science in and as performance. His current book project, Enlightenment Visibilities, studies the 18th century innovations that structure 21st century modernity by bringing previously unimaginable or imperceptible phenomena into the domain of perception and knowledge. Now, I would like to say that I added in the lightning in last night's show just for Al, because he's going to be talking to us about lightning. Let's just call it serendipity, right? So his title for us today is Spectacles of Science and Superstition.
Thank you so very much to Cindy and to Misty and to everyone that put this together, and for welcoming in someone who, I guess I can't really call myself a Walpolean. I'm actually not even going to be talking so much about literature either today, because what I want to think about is sort of the scientific contexts that are circulating that I think we want to put on the table. And I also, I want us to think about sort of the mysterious mother for a range of reasons, and certainly one of the most important ones surely must be how this notorious drama helped shape that emergent form of the Gothic mode. What do we get when we situate this play alongside Walpole's endlessly read Castle of Otranto as the twin headwaters of the Gothic's murky flow? What was the context and the catalyst for this play's monstrous birth in 1768? And what can it teach us about the sources and textures and meanings of the form? So I'd like us to think about what happens to the supernatural in Walpole's Gothic vision when we move from Otranto to the mysterious mother. Certainly we've got the gloomy, moldering castle motif, and there's certainly has an abiding sense that the places and spaces of this story are accursed. But in the mysterious mother, we find no examples of the hallucinatory literalism we had in Otranto. I'm thinking of that preposterous giant helmet, so manifestly and insistently real that it kills a young heir dead and even serves as a temporary holding cell for a suspected malefactor. That helmet is a deliberate and weirdly material signal that Otranto is truly haunted. The Gothic tale is straight up supernatural. Past crimes of usurpation and cruelty do not merely persist in guilty memory. Those wrongs are real, and the very palace is haunted by supernatural agents that avenge them, in fulfillment of what had seemed like a cryptically figurative prophecy. Turns out the warning, the castle and lordship of Otranto shall pass from the present family whenever the real owner should be grown too large to inhabit it, that was absurdly literal. Cue the supernatural, exit Manfred running from a giant. But the mysterious mother is quite different. In fact, it posits a deliberately anti-supernatural version of the Gothic. No giants stalk these ancient halls, no skeletons rattle their bones. Talking portraits are right out. The castle and heirs of Narbonne are accursed for sure, but there's no evidence that supernatural agents are to blame. In fact, the thunderstorm that we did have to cut to make it stageable, but that plays such an important role in Act 2, Scene 2, that so terrifies the denizens of the place, it triggers a pitched battle about the very possibility of supernatural agency, and it becomes an opportunity for Walpole to explicitly disavow it. So we begin with Florian and Edmund meeting the procession of orphan children making a pilgrimage to the Count's grave on the anniversary of his sudden death. When Florian overhears the scheming priest Martin encourage the children's superstitious belief that the Count is haunting the shrine, the blunt-talking soldier confronts him. His friend Edmund might kneel to omnipotence, Florian says, but that does not mean, quote, each gossip's dream, each village fable domineers in turn his brain's distempered nerves. And it's at this point that the storm comes on. Walpole's stage directions read, violent storm of thunder and lightning. But this triggers a debate about its proper interpretation. Martin declaims, quote, will this convince thee? Where's the gossip's dream, the village fable now? Hear heaven's own voice condemn impiety. And Florian, giving as good as he gets, responds back, hear heaven's own voice condemn imposture. What says the storm? Asks Florian in the scene, quite pointedly. And I'd say that Walpole is asking us to attend very closely to this question. Quote, pronounces it for thee or me? Asks Florian. Does none dispute within the compass of its bolt but we? Is the same loud-voiced oracle definitive for 50 various brawls? Or but a shock of clouds to all but us? In effect, Walpole has placed in Florian's mouth a compelling argument against superstitious belief and the credulous or knavish narcissism that would feed it and would assume that some storm is some sign from God. Now, it's a compelling argument, but I'd add we need to remember it's a very, very timely argument. For the 1760s were the decade that saw an intense interest in the nature of electricity, and in particular, its relationship to lightning and thunder. So Benjamin Franklin, of course, published experiments and observations on electricity in 1751, which theorized that the electrical fluid that natural philosophers had been experimenting with via electrostatic generators and Leyden jars was the same phenomena responsible for the awesome destructive power of electrical storms. Many naturalists accepted Franklin's hypothesis, but even into the 1760s, more than a few prominent dissenters resisted Franklin's claims in scientific circles, following the lead of the Abbé Nollet, who spoke out against identifying lightning with electricity. However, the 1760s drew the curtain on what became the second act of this scientific controversy. While most conceded lightning was electricity, there was a decades-long dispute that was erupted here about the efficacy of lightning rods. Perhaps what was the defining scientific matter of concern in the later 18th century. And in this sense, I'm thinking about Brutal Latour's thinking about matters of concern as in contradistinction to matters of fact. Since 1752, Franklin had been advocating and installing pointed lightning rods to draw down electrical charges from threatening clouds in order to lower the likelihood and decrease the deadliness of lightning strikes. Now, many English naturalists remained skeptical of their efficacy at all, while others threw their support behind Benjamin Watson, who advocated round-tipped lightning rods. And in fact, the first lightning rods were only installed in England in 1762. Just 2 years later, And just 2 years later, an article by Benjamin Wilson alleged that they would in fact prove more dangerous by making lightning strikes more likely. So while this philosophical dispute raged in the learned press and in the pages of the Philosophical Transactions, the newspapers of the day devoted a remarkable degree of attention to reports of lightning and electrical storms. The 16th of August, 1764 edition of the St. James Chronicle reported on, quote, a severe storm of thunder and lightning recently experienced in Boston when, quote, the heavens appeared in one continual blaze, as each rooftop lightning called down the celestial fire in what appeared to be a dazzling array of patterns to the eyewitness. Just one mighty strike did damage, it was reported, but there were no points erected within a half a mile of this house. And so as you can infer, this and so many of the other reports to appear in the popular press and Gentleman's Magazine during these years explicitly advocated for the erection of lightning rods. But that's not to say they all did. The 11th of April, 1765, Gazetteer and New Advertiser published an account from a maritime correspondent who reported that, quote, during a violent storm of thunder, lightning, and wind, a luminous body surrounded the spindle at their masthead, which appeared to be a perfect body of fire. May it not be conjectured, asked the editor, that iron spindles at the mastheads of ships often attract the lightning that would otherwise escape. Yet that same newspaper, a few months later, published a harrowing account penned by Thomas Esquine, who is the master of the Royal Navy frigate Tartar, about an electrical storm that he went through off the coast of Florida. After first having been struck by lightning on the quarterdeck, Erskine was brought below for medical attention. However, as he wrote, he, quote, had not been down a minute when we heard a noise equal to all the guns of the ship exploding at once. The shock of lightning or electricity destroyed in an instant the mainmast, main topmast, main top gallant mast, tearing them in a million pieces, large splinters flying all around the ship from many yards distant, the sails rent in as many pieces or threads, streams of electric fire rushing at the same time down to the bottom of the ship. In short, never was anything more tremendous. I think this helps contextualize the way Walpole concludes his storm scene. The children come running back on stage, interrupting the men's debate by carrying news of an off-stage conflagration. Oh, a storm so dreadful, cries one orphan. Some demon rides in the air. Martin, cynically goading them on, asks if none had the courage to face the fiend. And one reports, I winked, and I saw the lightning burst the monument. The shield of arms shivered to splinters. Ere I could repeat an Ave Maria, down with a hideous crash the cross came tumbling. Walpole didn't have to embellish this scene. We know that one of the reasons why lightning rods were such a crucial matter of concern, a genuine article of debate, is that they drew down, as it were, lingering superstitions about the causes of sublime natural events like lightning storms. While the question of the efficacy and the proper design of lightning rods was being debated by the learned on both sides of the Atlantic, people were still being electrocuted to death in shockingly high numbers due to the persistence of pre-modern beliefs that lightning was an act of God and a sign of his displeasure. And as Trent Mitchell discusses in a really great article in 18th Century Studies in 1998, according to many contemporaries, the only true safeguards from this providential instrument were a full trust in God and a hearty repentance to move God's heavy judgment. So clergy, not unlike the clergy we see in the play, might be using instances of lightning to extend their moral influence and authority over the flock, as Martin does. But it also meant they actually have to do something when storms threatened. And so generally this meant the ringing of church bells. But of course this exposed the faithful to terrible deaths by electrocution if they were up in the campanile, yanking on wet bell pulls when lightning struck. Now, this is not some Gothic prehistoric superstition. One report issued in Munich found that over a 33-year period, 386 lightning strikes hit bell towers, and they resulted in 103 fatalities. This report was published in 1784. No wonder that the Lloyd's Evening Post of May 1768, the same year Walpole penned The Mysterious Mother, felt the need to publish a long extract from the history of the Royal Academy of Paris on how to, quote, preserve oneself from thunder. TLDR, don't hide under trees, and for God's sake, don't ring any bells. I think there are a number of plausible reasons why Walpole's version of the Gothic shifts in this way from the Castle of Otranto to the Mysterious Mother. Chief among them, I think, is, as we've been discussing, Walpole's obstinate retention of that incest plot and his insistence that this play must be at heart an investigation of how the Countess copes with the unimaginable guilt of an act of a truly diseased imagination. He wants to focus it on internal struggles. Too much attention paid to supernatural agents would distract from his analysis of morbid psychology. Besides, Walpole may have quite sensibly been writing against the formal and material constraints of the theater. It is a bit of an open question whether he really thought this could be staged, but I'm kind of convinced that for a while there he thought this might have worked. One can certainly more readily narrate an electrical storm offstage than one can represent a giant falling cask onstage. But I do think the play's curious treatment of electricity in particular is deliberate, for it registers and draws cultural force from the ambiguity and suspicion that gathers around lightning as this kind of crucial matter of concern. These electrical debates revealed a certain persistence of pre-enlightened Gothic credulity, and while Walpole's protagonists reject Martin's supernatural trappings outright, and I think they speak in the voice we're supposed to acknowledge and agree with, the very popularity of this Gothic mode that Walpole initiates exploits even as it exercises these pre-modern fears and longings, and it gives voice and form to a wider suspicion of the Enlightenment project and discourses of science. And it's that wider suspicion of the discourses of science and the Enlightenment project that I think is in the air in 1768. That's the same year as Joseph Wright's remarkable portrait experiment on a bird in an air pump. And if you're familiar with that, the center of the portrait is that, the sphinx-like gaze of Wright's scientist who sort of stares blankly at us with his hand on the stopcock of that air pump, about to let the air back in to bring that bird back to life. But we're caught in that split-second moment of anticipation and fear. And I feel like the Mysterious Mother, as much as his sphinx-like gaze seems to be asking us, we're moderns, aren't we? Or if we've never been modern, or we aren't modern yet, or we can't ever hope to be modern, what a thrill it is to be caught in the play of these forces. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's fascinating. All right, moving right along. Our next paper will come from Judith Hawley, who is a professor of 18th century literature in the Department of English, Royal Holloway, University of London. Her research interests include the history of amateur performance, hooray, as well as publishing on Lawrence Stern encyclopedias, Siamese Twins, and Grub Street. She has edited various 18th century texts. Currently, she's writing a group biography of Pope, Swift, and the Scribblers Club. She's a regular speaker on the radio, most recently appearing on a discussion of the gin craze in On Our Time, BBC Radio 4. Her title for us today is The Beautiful Negligence of a Gentleman, Horace Walpole and Amateur Theatricals.
Thank you very much, Misty. I'm very happy to add to this wonderful thank fest we've been having here. I don't want to name people, but I really want to thank everybody who's been involved in making this thing happen. It's disappeared. I shouldn't try to do two things at once. It's there. It's good. Okay. Also a little bit of a modesty trope, a Walpolean modesty trope, which means it's not really modest at all. But I will be using some of the same examples and quotations that you'll have heard already, and I will try not to... I'll try to cut a few as I go, but I don't want to mess up the paper by... in the act of trying not to say something that you've heard from one of our other speakers. Anyway, here we go. It's generally assumed that it was because of its sensational subject matter that Walpole's Mysterious Mother did not have a public performance in its day. But I think the situation is more complex than that. It's not just the incest plot. Both Walpole's feelings about professional theatre and public reactions to his play were not clear-cut. For example, the Monthly Review considered it no less proper for representation than Otway's Orphan, which included a triple suicide. Moreover, David Worrell has discovered that it was adapted and performed at Thomas Dibdin's Surrey Theatre, admittedly not till 1821, thus after Walpole's death. He calculates it must have been seen by about 16,000 people who didn't riot didn't complain to the newspapers or otherwise signal their disapprobation of public dramatisation in central London of one of society's most supposedly sequestered vices. Now, the context in 1821, as David definitely demonstrates, is very different from that of 1768. But nonetheless, I do think that Walpole, at some point and in some part of himself, did envisage a public performance and wrote a comic epilogue for Kitty Clive to read, which we heard. But he did say, but I'm not so sure that she'd like to speak it. But the responses of even his close circle to this story of illicit passion quickly made him realise that for the sake of his reputation, he must suppress the play. Within weeks of completing it, Walpole admitted to his old school friend, George Montague, in April 1768, he did not think it would do for the stage. Now, I'm going to come back to that quotation because I think that idea of what he means by would it do for the stage is a little bit tricky. So I want to consider why Walpole did not think it would do for the stage and what that might tell us about theatrical culture in the second half of the 18th century. I'm going to focus on his aesthetic and social motivation more than the psychosexual ones. Other critics have read the plot of incest and maternal desire in The Mysterious Mother as Walpole's way of both representing and concealing homosexual feelings. Jill Campbell, for example, has demonstrated very deftly how that can be done and how one needs to be careful about doing it. But I'm going to consider The Mysterious Mother from the theatre history point of view and also to consider theatre history from a different vantage point. The Mysterious Mother was never performed in London's patent theatres, but performance in Drury Lane, Covent Garden and the Haymarket was not the only option available to playwrights in the 18th century. So if it wouldn't do for the stage, what kind of venue was it suited to? What kind of work did Walpole think it was? And what might that tell us about theatrical culture in the second half of the 18th century? Is it a closet drama? Now, we've heard something about this already today. Closet dramas, written to be read silently or out loud in small groups, were fairly common in the early modern period and enjoyed increasing popularity in the Romantic era when the tastes for melodrama, pantomime and comedy were driving serious verse drama from the public stage, or that was the perception. Walpole's play predates Joanna Baillie's great revival of the closet drama by about 30 years, and he's such a pioneer in inventing the Gothic novel, inventing the Gothic play. Is he also inventing a new form of closet theatre? To get a sense of what early modern closet drama was like and why it might appeal to Walpole, I'm going to quote Marta Straczynski, who says that in the early modern period, it was more common among communities which felt isolated from mainstream culture. She describes the form as part of a larger cultural matrix in which closed spaces, selective interpretive communities, and political dissent are aligned. Yet it's notoriously difficult to define closet drama. Jacqueline Mulholland points out quite recently that the term has a range of meanings from written to be read rather than performed to unperformable, either because not meeting the aesthetic or moral standards of the time or simply being too bad to be performed. Catherine Burrows has challenged the firmness of the distinction between closet and stage, especially if that distinction is figured in terms of a binary opposition between the closet as private, domestic, literary, mental, and feminine, and the theatre as public, spectacular, performative, physical, and masculine. Walpole is nothing if not a straddler of borders. The first outing of the play was a kind of closet performance, however defined. On the 17th of April 1768, Walpole and Conway read the play to an audience comprising Lady Aylesbury, Lady Littleton, and Miss Rich. And I don't think their responses to that are recorded, but it would be so nice to hear what they said. We know that he had 50 copies of the play printed at Strawberry Hill Press for private circulation, and that some of these books went astray, were circulated in manuscripts, and that he couldn't control what people did with his play or where it went. About 18 months after it was printed, Walpole learnt that Montague and a group of male friends, the boys, had found his play at Montague's house and insisted on leaving off gambling and drinking to read it through together. He was not pleased. I beg you would keep it under lock and key. It is not at all food for the public. So even Walpole thought this limited kind of public performance would not do and seemed to think that the privileged owners should keep it under lock and key. And he restricted access to even some of his close friends who thought that they should have had a copy sooner. Horace Mann didn't see a copy of it until 1779 when his nephew brought it out to him in Florence, and the nephew supposedly learnt it by heart on the way. Mann was delighted with it and thought it perfect for a closet performance, as his nephew proved by performing an impromptu iteration in what Paul Baines has described as a pleasantly Gothic setting. I won't read it, but I'll move on. Just to mention also a performance that we've heard several times discussed over the course of the day, the wonderful, sort of delicious, illicit performance that occurred in the Palace in 1786 when Francis Burney chanced upon a copy that Lord Harcourt. So Lord Harcourt lent his copy to Queen Caroline. She saw it and said, "Oh, this is by my friend Horace. I think we'll read this aloud." Invited people around, and there's sort of growing horror when they realised quite what they were reading. Nonetheless, Walpole did not completely rule out public performance. In the 1768 letter to Montague, which I quoted earlier, after admitting that he did not think it would do for the stage, he added, "though I wish to see it acted." In 1769, the letter to Montague is carefully balanced. "It is not at all food for the public, at least not until I am food for worms, good Percy," alluding to Shakespeare. Thus, he does leave open the possibility of a posthumous performance. And he does seem to have consulted his friend William Mason on how to prepare it for the stage. Now, some of us looked at Mason's marked-up copy earlier today, and one thing that should be said is that Mason and Walpole seem to have been exchanging plays backwards and forwards, asking each other to advise them. So Mason's advice on how to edit and make acceptable The Mysterious Mother comes immediately after Walpole had just written to him about 2 comedies Mason had sent him. And Walpole told Mason, one of them's good, yeah, we should get this put on, but do it anonymously, the other one not so good. So it was part of this sort of economy of circulation and advising, and Walpole was quite involved with dealing with the professionals in the theatre and getting things put on, and helping. Jefferson is someone we've already heard about as well. I'll come back to him. A lot of advice backwards and forwards about revisions, dealing with theatre managers. Publicly, he thanked Mason, said, "Wonderful, you're a genius, I don't know how you did it," but privately, Walpole rejected Mason's suggestions because he felt they totally destroyed his object, which was to exhibit a character whose sincere penitence was not degraded by superstitious bigotry, as he wrote on the back of the letter. He thanked him profusely for it, but taking such pains with his play, for, as Mr. Gray could tell you, I cannot correct myself. Walpole's attitude to correction is connected, I suggest, to his attitude to the possibilities for public performance. And we can see this more clearly in another letter to Mason, this time about works produced at the Strawberry Hill Press. He defiantly declared, "I hope future edition mongers will say of those at Strawberry Hill, they have all the beautiful negligence of a gentleman. He liked the typos. He didn't want them corrected." As a scholar and an editor, my first thought is that Walpole is boasting of a kind of culpable carelessness, a neglect, a lack of regard for what is correct. But I think he has in mind the original meaning of the term negligence. Careless indifference, as in appearance or dress, or in literary or artistic style. Later, freedom from artificiality or restraint, also an instance of this, now rare. So it's freedom that he's after, freedom to experiment, originality that he's praising in himself. But specifically, an indifference to professional standards, an indifference which grants him freedom from restraint. Crucially, it's a freedom granted him by his class status. Whether discussing the moral character of the Countess in his play or the correct printing of characters at Officina Arbutiana, Walpole expresses an aristocratic disdain for the vulgarity of professionals. In the 1769 letter to Montague I quoted earlier, when Walpole argued that he did not want his play performed during his lifetime, he didn't mention his moral reputation. Rather, he complained about the current standards of the professional theatre. Nay, it is not an age to encourage anybody that has the least vanity to step forth. There's a total extinction of all taste. Our authors are vulgar, gross, illiberal. The theatre swarms with wretched translations and ballad operas, and we have nothing new but improving abuse. I blushed at Paris when the papers came over crammed with ribaldry or with Garrick's insufferable nonsense about Shakespeare. Garrick's prologues and epilogues are as bad as his Pindarics and pantomimes. He was on polite terms with Garrick, but he repeatedly bad-mouthed him in private. So he didn't want his play to be mangled by professional performers. That's one of the most. I wouldn't deny that, that the incest is a factor too, but he was really worried about what would happen if his play was staged by professionals. And he wasn't the only one dissatisfied about the behaviour of actors and audience in the patent theatres. The mysterious mother, I suggest, can be seen as part of a larger process which was occurring at the margins of professional theatre, challenging its economic and cultural dominance. David Worrell, Jane Moody, and others have documented the attack mounted against the monopoly of the patent theatres by the rambunctious minor theatres in the later 18th century. To counter this threat, the patent theatres staged more spectacular productions and pantomimes to claw back the audience. And in response to this, to the perceived increase in the vulgarity, both of the productions and of the audiences at these ever bigger theatres at Covent Garden and Drury Lane, members of the social elite, including a number of Walpole's inner circle, took to staging their own private theatricals, in which they could control both the repertoire and the audience, admitting only people they had vetted. Private theatricals became fashionable both because of their exclusivity and because of the performativity, the fun. The people who acted yesterday, presumably you had a ball. You could see. So that idea that participating in culture is a major factor of the rise of private theatricals. But another factor is this aristocratic desire to control what they perform and who gets to see it. And these private theatricals became such a fixture in the social calendar that they were announced in the newspapers, in the listings. So all the major London newspapers which say what's on at Covent Garden, what's on at Drury Lane, they'd then say what Mrs. Hobart was doing, what was performing in the Richmond House Theatre. They are listed on the front page. And the newspapers often carry examples of the prologues and epilogues, plot summaries, reviews, a list of members of the audience. It's like those accounts of big parties and premieres where all the guests are listed. So the names of the guests are as important as the names of the performers. And Walpole collected a lot of this information in his massive collection of plays of George III. There's one volume of prologues and epilogues, and it's newspaper cuttings, and he indiscriminately includes both the patent theatres and the private theatres. He cuts and pastes the two kinds of documents together. And a number of his letters give accounts of attending private theatricals. And a play or a sort of pseudo-play that's been mentioned a couple of times today, The Dear Witches, this sort of satire based on Macbeth, it's a private theatrical. So it's not just a mock play, but it's a mock private theatrical performance of a version of Macbeth. So this sense of what a private theatrical is informs his sense of the theatre generally. So the play text, the whole performance culture, the audience culture. Now, for Walpole, these elite amateurs not only embodied rather than performed their roles, they also embodied taste. The upper classes were well schooled in music, dancing, and the fine arts, and some were keen to stretch these accomplishments further. Mostly, they adopted the repertoire of the patent theatres, producing a succession of comedies and cut-down Shakespeare. Some, especially those in Walpole's circle, wrote their own plays. Walpole's cousin Henry Seymour Conway performed his own adaptation of False Appearances at Richmond House in 1788 and 1789. His daughter and Walpole's heiress, Anne Damer, acted Mary Berry's fashionable friends at Strawberry Hill in 1801. The most prolific amateur playwright was Walpole's friend Elizabeth Craven, the Margravine of Anspach, who wrote, produced, and acted in a succession of plays in her Gothic-style theatre at Brandenburg House, Hammersmith, between about 1790 and 1805. Some of these scripts, written by amateur aristocratic playwrights, made it to the public theatres. Craven's comedy The Miniature Picture had a run of 3 nights at Drury Lane in 1780, and Conway's False Appearances enjoyed a run of 6 nights at Drury Lane in April 1789. And Walpole complained that the play was adapted to get cheap laughs. So I think Walpole had no opposition in principle to the social elites writing for the public. He himself had an afterpiece, Nature Will Prevail, performed regularly at the Little Theatre Haymarket between 1778 and 1788. For him, it was a question of aesthetic quality, a quality measured by his taste. In a letter to Hannah More, he refers to a skirmish in print about 2 noble playwrights, the Dukes of Newcastle and Buckingham. A gentleman essayist asked him why it was more ridiculous in the Duke of Newcastle to write his 2 comedies than the Duke of Buckingham to write The Rehearsal. Alas, I know but one reason, which is that it is less ridiculous to write 1 excellent comedy than 2 very bad ones. Peace be with such answerers. This dispute was prompted by an account of these 2 dukes and of the ancestors of the essayist William Belsham, included by Walpole in his catalogue of the Royal and Noble Authors of England, an ever-expanding labour of love first printed at Strawberry Hill Press in 1758 and augmented and revised in various reissues. In works such as his catalogue of the Royal and Noble Authors of England, he builds a case for the contribution of the upper classes to culture as producers as well as consumers of literature. He was not so blinded by his class that he could not see the faults of his royal and noble authors. He frequently girds himself up to produce his most withering wit at their expense. For example, after describing the writings of William and Margaret Cavendish, the Duke and Duchess of Newcastle, he declares, "What a picture of foolish nobility was this stately poetic couple, retired to their own little domain and intoxicating one another with circumstantial flattery on what was of no consequence to no mortal but themselves. Well, people in stained glass houses should not throw the first stone, Mr. Walpole." Yet he values this category of writers for 2 reasons. The first is that they were not career writers. Their authorship was secondary to, or sometimes the product of, their service to the state. The second is that their independence from the market, in his view, made them better able to establish standards of taste and excellence. Walpole resisted public performance because he deplored the current state of the theatre. Writing to Robert Jeffson in 1777 about this gentleman author's new play, Vitellia, Walpole declared, "If I were the author, I should be very sorry to have my tragedy murdered, perhaps miscarry, and to give your works to unworthy performers is like sacrificing a daughter to a husband of bad character." Actors were not the only problem. Walpole also directed blame at theatre managers who, because of their enslavement to convention and dependence on the box office, were unwilling to foster truly original writing on the stage. Among the reasons he gave to Montague in 1768 for not putting his mysterious mother on the stage, Walpole fulminated, "Nor am I disposed to expose myself to that jackanapes Garrick, who lets nothing appear but his own wretched stuff, or that of creatures still duller, who suffer him to alter their pieces as he pleases." He encouraged Jeffson to produce his Count of Narbonne, which we've heard of already, not at Covent Garden, where it was staged in 1781, but in his hometown of Dublin, where he could oversee rehearsals. Managers will take liberties and often curtail necessary speeches so as to produce nonsense. Take warning, David. Methinks it is unkind to send a child of which you have so much reason to be proud to a foundling hospital. So lots and lots of metaphors of work as baby, of murder, and so on. So for Walpole, the beautiful negligence of a gentleman represented a freedom from rules and the liberty to experiment. Repeatedly, he objected to the way that French neoclassical unities of time, place, and action were imposed on British drama. I'll skip this quotation. There's a lovely quotation about cats in his pocketbook, but I need to move on. I want to get a cat into every lecture I give. Usually I show a photograph of my own cat at some point. But anyway, moving swiftly on. So we've heard about the postscript to the 1781 printing of the Mysterious Mother. I'll just pick out a few phrases. He talks about people being enslaved to rules. He prefers an ampler latitude of thought, in pursuance of which he has introduced some novelty on our stage. He boasts that the cast of the noble play, unlike that of the cast of the whole play, unlike any other that I'm acquainted with, in particular the character of the Countess, is certainly new. Novelty, originality, freedom, these are his watchwords. Mostly, Walpole asserts these freedoms for himself, but I think that he hints that by exercising such freedoms, gentlemen might raise standards of taste and reform in the theatre. Now, I just want to end by turning to Cynthia. That some of my impetus for this work on Walpole has come from her wonderful article on Walpole and female genius, where she talks about how Walpole's championing of Lady Di, who did those incredible soot water drawings, he was interested in a number of women geniuses, many of whom were on the sort of fringes of respectability or downright unrespectable. And he valued their lack of training, their leisuredees, and their independence from the marketplace. And that a lot of his emphasis in championing them was to oppose academic standards, the standards of the Royal Academy. And I would like to suggest that his attitude to the theatre was very similar. He's insisting on developing a kind of an amateur culture in the theatre, as well as an amateur culture in the arts. And although we don't expect necessarily to find the avant-garde in the amateur sphere, I do think that the private theatricals might allow us to rethink the significance of the emergence of the professional theatre and the kind of complexity that it entails. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And one quick PSA before we go on. If you saw me pulling my cell phone out here, I promise I wasn't texting my friends. If you are interested in promoting any of the pictures, ideas, or images that you've been a part of these last 2 days, you can tweet it, and there's a hashtag, Wallapalooza. And so if you hashtag it, then maybe you can see what others thought and captured and reflected on. All right, wonderful. Well, I get to introduce my new colleague and fellow script conspirator, David Worrell, who gave us that fantastic cut of The Mysterious Mother and chiseled a playable, shorter piece out of Walpole's longer work. David is Emeritus Professor of English at Nottingham Trent University, England. He's published widely on long 18th century theater, including Theatric Revolution and Celebrity Performance and Reception. He's held grants, fellowships, and has more plaudits than we have time left today. But these include the Leverhulme Trust, the Arts and Humanities Research Council, and Lewis Walpole Library fellowships. And today he is going to speak to us about the play under the title, I Beg You Would Keep It Under Lock and Key, the mystery of the 1821 Mysterious Mother performances.
Okay, right. So again, if I can say, it's been an excellent opportunity to come here at the invitation of Cindy and the Lewis Walpole Library, and of course, having been involved in it right from the start, to start off with the cut with Misty. So it seems a long time ago, but it's an excellent opportunity to do these things. And so what I'll be talking about, in fact, is some of the things which have been discussed earlier. So I hope that as I'm the last speaker, this will be light but not lightweight. That's my kind of aim, really. But to go back to to look at it the other way around. So really what I'm talking about is not the way in which the mysterious mother was controlled by Walpole, but really how it escapes. So it's escape from control really is a story that I have to tell in kind of two halves. So this is really, I guess, September 1769 is the first read-through of the mysterious mother, and I'll come on to talk. I'll show you on the next slide. But these are the personnel involved in George Montagu's house. I've had such a house full of schoolboys for a week that their noise still tingles in my ears. Thank God their holidays are over and they are gone. Sir George Osborne, Colonel Burgoyne, which is not the one who surrendered at Saratoga, because I thought there'd be an American link, but there's not. Captain Boscawen, young Osborne, a parson of theirs, and one of their squires came all upon me on a sudden and lived riotously from morning to night. So that's the context of how they then do this read-through. The boys found your tragedy, the mysterious mother, and the boys, as they are, they had no patience till it finished it. And we read the acts amongst us, for my lungs could not pritchard it through. They left off quins, gambling, and claret, and were the Florians of your play. The churchmen indeed looked grave, but they threw him his 10 commandments and a bottle of port, and amused themselves without. They would have got it by heart. However, a few similes they have retained, and a cap with one another some of the lines that struck them most. So what we've got there is, so first of all, they've kind of captured a character, which is the Florian one. So that's the first reception history, if you like, of Florian as a character. And of course, what he's saying is that they've learned by heart some of the speeches, and of course, they seem to have read through it. So it's in that kind of riotous context. So already within a year, the mysterious mother is kind of out there amongst that very mixed group of individuals who seem not least completely fully at ease with it. They're having a very good time. So there's none of these kind of darker aspects about incest or Gothic or any of the things which we may associate with it. They associate the play, and they're the first people to read it and to act it or read it through, a stage reading perhaps. They begin the reception characteristics of that drama. And so we tend to have forgotten this. It seems to me that the private, it's in that private theatrical mode, in fact, that the play has escaped, and it's become something which, of course, Horace has no control over. And so there, of course, we get him after the horse has bolted, as you may think. And of course, that's my point, really, is that these famous lines about keeping it under lock and key, one needs to look back at what they have actually done with the text. And in fact, although he says to keep it under lock and key, in fact it has already escaped. There wasn't a lock in the first place, if you like. And so that really gives the prompt for this way in which that first audience and players in it are completely at ease with this play, is that this is how this culture is receiving this play. As something that they can enjoy as an entertainment and something which they can learn and that they are comfortable with. So unless it's some other version of the mysterious mother that they've got, but I don't think there's any evidence for that. That's what we know about that. And so the thing that I came across some years ago is the venue of the first performance, which is at the Surrey Theatre, one of the minor or illegitimate theatres on the south side of the Thames. And that's really important. It's on the south side of the Thames, because what it meant is that they didn't have to send a licensing copy to the Lord Chamberlain, because the Lord Chamberlain's remit only ran in Westminster on the north side of the Thames. So we don't have a text manuscript text for the performance that they did for that reason, because it escapes through that way. So the manager of it is Thomas Dibdin. So he's an important character because he's the one who's probably done the first cut of it, as I'll begin to show. So that's a theatre previously known as the Royal Circus, and it's part of that expansion in the minor or the illegitimate theatres that begins around really around 1818, with the opening of Waterloo Bridge in 1818, because from then, one Waterloo Bridge opens up. You can walk from Covent Garden and Drury Lane across to the other side of the river, and as you may know, the present Old Vic is the Royal Coburg Theatre. That's the same site, and these two, the Surrey and the present-day Old Vic, we'll call it, the Royal Coburg Theatre, were in competition with each other. So not only do you have this opening up of new theatres on the south side of the Thames, but also elements of competition. So it's a very vigorous community of theatre, not a community. They kind of hated each other, but trying to find new material. And this is the new material that they found. Now, when I published the essay, I didn't have an image included in the essay of the playbill, because I only found it refound it recently in the bowels of my computer. So that's, I think, the next exhibit. So it's a photocopy. So it's a photograph of a microfilm. So because there were 10 performances, there were 10 of these. Of course, I'm only showing you the first one there, and I'm just going to blow that up a bit. And so you can see that there's no kind of ambiguity about that. The serious melodramatic romance in 3 acts, founded on a tragic play written by the late Horace Walpole, Earl of Orford, and presented for the first time, as it says, never acted before, under the title of Narbonne Castle or the Mysterious Mother. There is no ambiguity about what that play is, and that is exactly what the play is. You see that as it goes on to say, a noble author, and he refers to the Byron preface to Marino Falieri, so that's his kind of cue, if you like. And he goes on to say, there are, however, in the fable, circumstances of a dreadfully terrific, dreadfully terrific a nature that most material alteration in its construction has been thought necessary. Now, first of all, because it's a theatre on the south side of the Thames, they have to put music in. Now, that's not a choice. It's not an elective choice. That is because the theatres on the south side of the Thames, and the theatres outside of Covent Garden and Drury Lane, if they have to do musicalised versions. So the patentees, Covent Garden and Drury Lane, who have the monopoly on speech, protect their monopoly by oppressing the minor theatres. And certainly in Dibdin's case, he had people, spies around from the patentees to see what he was doing. They were trying to close him down, essentially, and they were trying to close down the others. So, because the patentees thought that they were playing spoken drama. So this is a musicalized version of the play, contracted to 3 acts. What I want to emphasize is that this is not something that they elected to do. This was something because of the regulatory circumstances that they had to do. And so probably the reason why it contracts to 3 acts is because once you've added the music, which they needed to keep their license, of course, the whole play takes a lot more time, and of course he would have seen, as I saw, that it's eminently cuttable anyway, and so that is what he was doing there. And the other thing that I found out only the other day since I've been here, what I hadn't realised at the time I brought out the journal article, in 1819, Dibdin had tried to lease Drury Lane, and so Farmington, the Walpole Library in 2017 bought some new manuscripts which expose and which go through his attempts to take over the lease of Drury Lane, which he failed. Now, what had happened to Dibdin is that he'd raised from a linen merchant in the Strand, Doyley's Warehouse, £10,000 to pay for the lease, plus Drury Lane wanted him to pay £3,000 to refurbish the theatre. So although the new theatre, in the newly refurbished Drury Lane had opened in 1813, by the time that he comes to take over the lease, or tries to take over the lease, it had fallen into disrepair, despite Edmund Kean and all of that. And anyway, to cut a long story short, it came to sealed bids, but he was not there when the bids were opened. And so, according to Dibdin, he felt that he'd been cheated, that somebody at the last stage had opened up a sealed bid and then put in £100 more. And so, he had every reason to be antagonistic against Drury Lane. And so the reason I think he chooses to do it is that it's a spoiling attempt on Marino Falieri, which Drury Lane are bringing out. The circumstances of that play is that the publisher tries to bring an injunction against Drury Lane to stop them staging the play. Byron, of course, isn't in the country anyway. The license from the Lord Chamberlain comes back to Drury Lane, but the servants don't tell the manager that the license is in the playhouse, and so so that afternoon they're going to stage it anyway. So even though the injunction hasn't been heard, Drury Lane, in other words, are themselves playing a dangerous game. And so what you've got really is a way in which all these theatres are competing in underhand ways against each other. And so in a way, The Mysterious Mother is part of that attempt by Dibdin to get his own back on Drury Lane, where he had these really awful experiences. But this is my main point, really. It is a 3-act version. We can think of good reasons why it should be a 3-act version. It's also musicalized because of the regulatory environment. It's not something that he would have chosen to do himself, perhaps. And so that's how that came about there. And so what I've tried to do meanwhile, and this is really the end piece, really, is that this is the first actress to play the Countess. So this actress is the one who establishes the role in theatre history, Miss Margaret Taylor, and that's an image of her. And as you see there, that's Miss Margaret Taylor of the Surrey Theatre, and there she is. She's referred to there. Jacqueline, Countess of Narbonne, the mysterious mother, is played by Miss Taylor, and there we have that actress located with the Surrey Theatre there. And so I was trying to do some calculations the other day, and if you accept my interpretation that first 1769 read-through would also have had somebody playing the Countess. So all those, male guys who were in that house that night, again, they're very comfortable with playing, a big female role. This makes, by my calculation because you've got them, so we count the schoolboys, as we call them. So that's the first countess. We don't know who that one would have been. And then we've got that one, that's number 2. Then there's the Glasgow production in 2001, and so Georgina here is the 4th countess. And that's the end of my talk. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone. And I'd like to invite our speakers up here to these chairs. We have almost 25 minutes for some questions. So, is there anyone who would like to lead off the questioning? We have, once again, the handheld mics, and we do ask that you wait until the microphone gets to you because we're recording this for posterity. The Countess has a question.
Thank you. It looks to me as though that first production must have been a huge amount of fun, with people sharing the part of Hannah Pritchard, just maybe passing it around them and probably competing to see who could do her best, perhaps moving it as well, And the other thing I wanted to ask you, perhaps I should have asked at home, but we didn't get time, is the adaptations made to the script, that the way that the kind of parts have been blinged up so that the plot is, the Gothic plot is kind of foregrounded, you've got the confessor, the convent, and all this kind of stuff. I mean,
the spectral monk.
Does it give you...
Yes, the spectral monk is in it.
Yeah, the spectral monk.
Yeah.
I mean, have you got any sense, or is there any script at all, that anything that suggests what it might have been, reviews?
Yeah. There are a few reviews that I've been able to find. Again, there are no complaints. Nobody complains, lines up outside the theatre. And so it was reviewed, but there are not many reviews. And generally, because it plays for 10 nights, it's just a perfectly reasonably good success story for that particular playhouse. So it's just kind of average. It's nothing special in their run. Of productions at that time. I mean, Dibdin was doing more experimental drama. I think the one that I worked on before is called something like The Fall of Troy, where he manages to refer to the Sun and the Norwich Union insurance companies, because they're obviously sponsoring him to do that. So it's that kind of theatre, if you like, so it's a very kind of normal, but it's not Covent Garden or Drury Lane type of thing.
I would just say it's so tantalizing. You get these little traces that seem to speak so big. If there's a spectral monk in that production, it seems like pretty much what I said about the play in 1768 is not applying, and it would presumably be sort of a part and parcel with at that point a robust sort of Gothic drama tradition. And the question that I wouldn't be able to answer, right, is to what extent is the stagecraft and special effects that marked the the patent theaters, to what extent was that replicable at Surrey or not?
Yes.
But the playbill does also suggest that the plot has been censored, and you didn't really, as you can say, yes. And you've skated over that.
How do you arrive at that then?
Well, hang on one second. Let's get Dale. We're going to get you to take the microphone.
There are, however, in its public circumstances of so dreadful, terrific a nature that most material alteration in its construction has been thought necessary, which is to hope has been affected without injury either to the poetry or the intense and powerful interest which pervades the romance. My sense is that...
Yeah, but you see, if I can carry on, because you can walk into the trap a little bit.
That strikes me as just obvious. I mean, he's talking
So,
no, the intended incest.
because what would be the point in saying this is the mysterious mother by Walpole if it's circulating in the print culture, which is what everybody's been talking about, so that everybody knows it's circulated in the print culture. So it is a book everybody's been saying, which is known, and then you don't do it the way that people have read it. And so what you've got really, because the playbill is a mediation between the performance and the audience, what you've run into the trap is this is viewer caution advised. Okay? So that's the come on. Oh, you want to go and see that play because there's something going on in it. So would you have taken out the incest? Why produce that play?
I don't think it would have been taken out, but I think it would have been a version of the play closer to Mason's suggested changes.
It's referring to some sort of alteration materially around the incest that has
which is the music, right?
No.
That's a material alteration.
I don't see any evidence for that whatsoever.
No, it's been tidied up.
I mean, exactly. And it's drawing. I agree entirely that it's drawing attention to the scandalous nature of the play, well, perhaps avoiding obscenity. But it seems like that's the draw. Like, there's something like intensely dark and frightening about the incest plot here. We're kind of we're gonna stage this in such a way that's legal, and at the same time we're going to remind you about everything that's so treacherous about this play.
Kind of alcohol-free wine. Is what you're saying.
A follow-up question, but then also a comment. Two questions. In the reviews that you say you've seen, does anybody mention that the incest is still there?
No.
They don't indicate either way.
They're having a good time, just as the schoolboys were.
Yeah.
That's my point. Okay, they don't say anything about the incest.
Then the other question is what is the nature of the scandal? Because we've heard that there are all these incest things, and I think is it Emma Cleary? I think Marcie talks about this in one of her articles that one of the most scandalous things about the play is the mysterious mother's obvious lust.
Yes.
That's more scandalous than incest in itself. It's the desiring mother. The actively desiring mother who kind of rapes her son. And that's the real scandal. Or that's more of a scandal than incest.
Or it's part of it. I mean,
It's,
the two are make an interesting entanglement. But it's sexuality in one way or another.
And representing it is very different from reading it.
Yeah.
That's more powerful, and so reading it is a little safer.
Well, and I'm going to take moderator and director's privilege here and say that, in this work of representation, we're back to some of the problems that Judith has set out for us. Yes. And the question that both Marcie and Jean brought to the floor is this: did Walpole know this was unperformable? And I would just take that question apart and make a distinction between performable and public.
Yes.
And, I think that's where we can kind of find our way in and think about his imagined amateur and private audiences as a place where it is indeed quite performable, and the intimacy of those gatherings, as we discovered in rehearsal with a very small group, elicits a lot of reaction. The ick and gag reflexes, these sort of engagement with production itself that's possible, that has something to do with scale of audience and the intimacy of the gathering. So I think that's where we can kind of take back apart the question about the performability of it into the possibility of private and amateur performance.
Could I just add something? It's not that it's retrospective. You don't see anything going on between those two people. They report it. So it's not as offensive as actually, it's kind of French in a way, or Greek even, so you only see her confessing to what she's done, and there is physical contact when, in our production, he caught her, and you could say that he helped her stab herself, which is phallic. But you wouldn't need to do that in a physical representation. You could do an awful lot with music, which might help make it a lot shorter as well. and perhaps maybe a little bit more entertaining, because we did discover that some of it was a little bit funny, you know. So there are two things going on there as well. And I think if you cut the incest out, I mean, you've got a very big problem with the whole play, really. You know, I mean, that's the whole point, you know. So,
but look at the title the title of the play alludes to Jeffson's The Castle of Narbonne, which is already a sanitized version that only has names from. So it alludes to that with a bit sort of a couple of spoonfuls more of a mysterious mother in that.
One of the reviewers refers to it, mistitles it as the Countess of Narbonne, which is really quite interesting.
Well, and as we discovered too, in a cut, music can do a great deal of work for you.
Yeah. Could I ask? This is for Judith, really. I was interested in, which I really enjoyed your paper, but I was really interested in the ties between the way that Walpole controls the circulation of text using the Story Hall Press, and decides very carefully whether it's published under his own name, published separately, but not under his own name, or not published at all, and just circulated among a small group, and how some things are printed but not circulated at all, intentionally. In the same way with your ideas with the players as to how that's contained to an amateur and private group, as we've said. Although, of course, it would have helped the argument if he actually had been involved in any sort of production at all.
No, he really isn't,
He absolutely isn't. But it does tie into the other point, which is the whole gentility business, that if you're doing it in amateur theatricals by gentlemen, then, of course, there's that great line about how a gentleman will naturally act a gentleman much better than someone like Garrick, how a good naturally is. So there's all that, the whole class thing.
Certainly my text, but I might not have read it out, so it makes it quite clear that there is no record of a private theatrical performance of it. And I don't have any record of Walpole himself on stage, but he certainly attends private theatricals quite a lot. And that the way in which this the audience and the actors are drawn from the same class, in a way that the performance we saw yesterday, what we saw yesterday was kind of an elite amateur dramatic performance, wasn't it? Where you're the intellectual aristocracy out there, and you're the same kind of people. We're all from roughly the same group, aren't we? So it's very, that sort of circularity, the mirror world of the audience and the actors being the same. So he participates in private theatricals in that way, but it wasn't performed. I think he probably did feel it never. Anyway, so there's that. On the printing of texts. You know much more about how the printing press worked and the audience worked, but I do think there's a way in which, as you say, you sort of answered your own question, the choice of who he circulates things to, the amount of attention he gives to the authorship. You know, some works are the author is puffed up enormously, or the press has its own agency, the press speaks, so the press takes on a life of its own. So there's something much more personal, non-commercial, I think is part of the point there. You know, that these are things given as gifts. It's part of a culture of exchange, not a marketplace culture. And definitely I think the point about the actors. I forgot to read a passage, just very, very briefly, a short quotation from his description of a performance with the Hobarts in it. And I was quite surprised that he has this very favourable account of Mrs. Hobart. You might know Albinia Hobart from Gilray's satirical Prince, where he draws a complete circle and puts a tiny little circle on top. That's her head. She was a woman of substantial means, and he describes a 1782 production of Mirth is All in the Wrong at Ham Common. Mrs. Hobart played admirably and most genteelly, which was very refreshing, as one never sees anything like a woman of fashion on the stage. The eldest Miss Hobart, so lovely and so modest, was not acting; she was the thing itself. So there's a sense that there's authenticity of it, and you get this also in Lady Craven's plays, that if you're acting a tragedy or you're acting a drama of public importance, you have those people who play those roles in real life playing the role of king, the Earl of so-and-so, the Duke and so and so on. So there is a certain kind of authenticity and a certain kind of campness combined in this, to bring in sort of Marcie's point about the sort of complexity, the double nature of Walpole's attitude to most things. I hope that encapsulates that a bit. There were a number of complaints about the private theatricals, so to take another slightly different view of it. There are a number of examples of people praising the very fine and authentic performance. There are also complaints that the aristocrats were taking bread from the professional actors' mouths. That both they're taking their jobs and also stealing their audiences. So when productions were done in London during the theatrical season, Sheridan basically closed down one of the private theatres, the Picnic Society, because they were taking his audience.
Jill?
Yeah, thank you so much for these papers. They're just so informative and thought-provoking. And I have kind of two unrelated things that I wanted to say or ask about. Al, that was just such a revelatory basic point about Castle of Otranto versus the world of the mysterious mother, that there aren't supernatural forces there. And I think about the Radcliffe Monk Lewis kind of struggle and so on, the rationalized supernatural. But I was just thinking, looking at it through the light that you shed on it, and also thinking back to Nicole Garrett's paper this morning, that the Countess is, read as suspect and transgressive because she doesn't believe in the supernatural. Mm-hmm. She's accused of that, and then she knows, and we eventually know, that no, that's not the nature of her crime at all. She has this terrible past crime sin that she has committed, and I was just playing with the sense that Walpole was doing something transgressive, perhaps, in the terms of the play, in not extending faith to the supernatural. I don't know how the sexual crime and the belief or disbelief in the supernatural. And I'll just throw out, while I have the mic, my unrelated. So just to David and maybe others, Marcie or Julia could comment. I was just really struck with that letter from George Montague. We keep talking about the boys, but you gave the birth dates. They're not boys.
Well, yes, it's a kind of homosocial group, isn't it?
Yeah, I just thought that would be interesting in terms of this, a different aspect of the kind of amateur, the spontaneous staged reading there, the kind of fantasy juvenileness of the group. So just throw those out for anyone.
Well, to respond to your first points, it's kind of remarkable that in these two texts by Walpole you see this sort of fundamental tension in the Gothic. We want to sort of explore this sort of, there's a fundamental disagreement about to what extent should we assume that there's supernatural forces, do we problematize that or do we play with it? And I don't know, I mean, I guess that, I always read I would have read the Countess's problem as not that she is a heretic by refusing to believe in the supernatural, refusing to believe in the magical power of confession to, enact a miracle to wipe your soul clean. I guess I didn't think of it that way. I thought it was just a matter of her just resisting the authority that she'd have to give over, right? So she knows as soon as she speaks her truth, she's basically going to be, manipulated, subject to blackmail. But I think that is an interesting point, and she, they certainly accuse her of not being faithful in that way. It's interesting that position is put in the mouth of fools and children, right? And it's put in the mouth of, explicitly cynical and manipulative priests. And, I think, you read the play and you're kind of supposed to take this sort of, demystified perspective on this. Of course, it's not really, a supernatural event, and we ought to, they're way more interesting sort of Gothic themes to explore rather than, is this world, full of ghosts and, vengeful gods and things like that. And I guess in my thinking about it is sort of engaged in this sort of lightning controversy and kind of a larger sort of enthusiasm, but also suspicion of this, Enlightenment science project, and in particular the way in which it comes home. That there's so much of interest in doing one's own experiments, and it becomes itself a kind of private theater, a sort of performance discourse that folks sort of participate in. I guess I was thinking that Walpole is sort of picking up a similar ambiguity. Why are folks doing this? Are they, really, learning some substantial truths about the universe? Are we really sort of engaged in the project of enlightenment? Or are we just thrilling to this stuff and kind of enjoying this sort of confusion, delight, and surprise? And I feel like it's kind of a similar menu of ambiguous pleasures that you partake of those science performances as you would from this Gothic performance.
So just to what you were saying, Jill, before, I think what's really interesting is that what we see in the reception of the play, or its non-reception or whatever, is a range of sociable theaters. Some are more professional, some are more private, and some can be more spontaneous or not. And they are all, it's quite an interesting range. And I'm thinking myself of Abigail Williams' recent book about sociable reading, where she talks about reading drama as well. I think that that's an element of literary reception that we are, we have a lot more work to do on capturing the range. So that's...
Nicole, I think we have time.
Thank you for these really rich papers. My question is for Jean, and I was wondering, I remember reading Clary's article on the mysterious mother, or her contribution to the edited volume, and she says, or she claims that audiences at the time would have noticed these resonances with earlier incest plays and wouldn't have been shocked by it. And she particularly calls attention to plays such as Dryden's collaboration with Nathaniel Lee, the 1679 adaptation of Oedipus. But she doesn't give any kind of textural sense of actual evidence of reception, which would indicate that readers were reading those plays together. So I was wondering if you'd come across any evidence of that.
I don't know about reading the plays together. Certainly, just the responses, for example, to Phaedra and Hippolytus, when they, you would see more complaints about Phaedra and her desires in contrast to, say, what they saw in Aurengzebe, or in earlier plays, in Greek versions of, say, the Phaedra story, or Oedipus even, so that they were aware of other plays. And I'm not sure, in some cases from having read them, in other cases from having seen them, because the response to Phaedra and Hippolytus, it really very much a response to seeing something staged and spoken about. Walpole, actually, when he's talking about Phaedra, and I think he's talking about Phaedra talking to the chorus in the Greek play, is talking about how illogical it is. The responses that, say, Gilden had to Smith's play are about staging it and hearing Phaedra vocalize the fact that she desires her son. And that's... So I think that there is kind of an awareness of this body, a place... I mean, certainly nobody could avoid knowing the Orphan. It was one of the hugely popular plays. When you get to the Old Manor House, of course, the character of the Orphan is Monimius. So I think that in general, that these were the popular ones were just lurking in people's minds. I wouldn't give that claim, say, to Don Sebastian, or necessarily as you got further along to, say, Phaedra and Hippolytus, although it was staged multiple times in the 1750s. So it's really hard unless you can trace down going through a journal or finding letters to have somebody say, well, I saw this and it made me think of seeing such and such a play. So I don't know if that helps, but...
I'm afraid we're out of time, but I want to thank everyone from the Lewis Walpole Library who's made this possible, everyone from the Yale Center for British Art, especially Jane up in the back, and thank you all for taking a chance on a crazy experiment to stage this play, in which I think we've learned a great deal, and thanks to our panelists and everyone for their participation. All right, have a great afternoon.